Hi there. I'm your host, Mike Hingson, and welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset. Today, we get to interview Roberto Carlos Mayer, and Roberto lives in São Paulo, Brazil, and has a really interesting story to tell, I'm sure, in a lot of ways. One of the things I learned from reading his bio is that he brought microcomputers to South America as a teenager in the late 70s. That must be kind of fun. But Roberto has had a long career as an entrepreneur, working with a lot of different kinds of fields, and we'll get to that. He's also a writer and has been an entrepreneur, as I said, most of his life. So, Roberto, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're really glad you're here.
Thanks, Michael. I'm very glad for your invitation and hope to share a little bit of my long story.
Well, why don't we start at the beginning of your long story? So why don't you tell us a little bit about you growing up and all that?
Okay, I started my involvement with computers, as you mentioned, in the early 70s. Now, at that time, I was in college, and the chemistry professor told me that his brother had brought some microcomputers from the United States here down, and he was gathering people to try to understand what they did, how they could be programmed, and so on. In school, I was always a very good student in math and other scientific subjects. So I accepted that invitation, and from that time on, I started working with computers. Up to this day, I didn't change my mind.
Worked out pretty well. Well, so go back a little bit further. Have you always lived in São Paulo?
Yes, in fact, I have lived in São Paulo all my life.
So, what did your parents do, and how did that shape what you do?
Well, in fact, I have been always independent. I started working at very early. I think I was at that time 11 or 12 years old when I started lecturing some colleagues in school in hours after school, and I developed my independence very, very early in life, and always managed to do many things simultaneously. I think that's the characteristic. And besides my work with computers, I've always managed to bring together studying and social activities and volunteering activities since very, very early age.
Well, when you were 11 and 12 and you said you were lecturing to some of your classmates, what did you lecture about?
Well, in fact, I lectured about math, about physics, about chemistry, about English. There were some classmates which had very difficulty in some of the subjects, and teachers always consider these people to be those that would not be able to learn it, but I managed to teach them and to pass the exams. So their parents were very satisfied with my work. And so this was at that time for me a significant income source, which also allowed me to decide what to do with my money, which normally is, even at those times, was not the standard behavior for teenagers.
No, it certainly wasn't. So did your parents encourage you to do this?
In fact, my father was never very involved with me, but my mother, in fact, encouraged this because she knew that it was the thing I like to do.
And so she encouraged you to develop your talents. Did
Exactly.
she work? Did she work?
Yes, she She worked as a secretary at a big corporation.
And what did your father do?
My father was an eternal student. He was involved in some very exotic subjects, which I never got to understand 100%. But he didn't have as far as I know, a regular working schedule for long.
Mm-hmm. But you were always interested in math and science and technology, which is kind of cool. And you learned to program these computers that your chemistry professor told you about. So what languages did you program in? What did you learn?
Well, the first language I learned to program in was the basic language.
Yeah. I remember basic.
But then I started studying the organization of the microprocessors and teach myself to program in assembler also. Yeah. So I learned the assembler for the Apple II chip, for 8080 chip, and many others I don't remember now.
Well, so you did that in college, and when you left college, what did you? Well, when you graduated, what did you get a degree in?
Well, in fact, the I don't know the educational system here in Brazil is a little bit different. So we get a standard denomination just for completing our studies as teenagers, and then we get into the university. In fact, when I left school, I started working due to this involvement with computers, first as a freelancer, and then in a very short time period, I managed to start working for a very huge local bank here in Brazil, where I was responsible for introducing this microcomputer culture that was at the beginning of the 80s. And so I had the challenge to, once again, to manage my university studies simultaneously to this professional work, which was obviously all day.
What were networks like back then? So you talk about using microcomputers, but they had to, in one way or another, communicate with each other, I would assume, right?
Well, in fact, communication was very, very restricted.
Yeah.
We had some communication through serial cables. I remember
RS-232. I know.
And another experiment I was involved, which is also uncommon. At that time, there were no printers for microcomputers. So we adopted a telex machine to be used as a printer for microcomputers. But the telex machines don't use the ASCII character system. So we had to study how the telex machines code the characters they print, and then develop a routine to do the translation from the computer ASCII character set to the set used by telex machines, which is called Baudot. It was invented by a French mathematician called Baudot.
So basically, when you printed something, the process was that the microcomputer, whatever computer you were using, would send the ASCII characters to a translating computer, which would translate and then send it to the printer?
No, it was all running on the same computer. We developed
So you developed it on the little microcomputer.
In assembler language, which was running behind this high-level programming language.
Got it.
And we connected the telex machine to the serial port, so it was all running on a single microcomputer with 8K of RAM memory.
You didn't even have a parallel cable, huh?
No,
Yeah.
at that time, not.
Well, when I went to college at the University of California at Irvine, one of the things that I didn't have access to was any kind of a Braille printer. They didn't really have much of any of those things back then. And one of the people in the computer science department, who I got to know very well, Dick Rubenstein, found a place that that had developed a sort of a way of making a Braille printer. It was using one of the, wasn't an IBM Selectric. It was one of the computers with the little print cylinders, or one of the printers with the little print cylinders. And somebody had developed a routine that, and they, with a modified version of the cylinder that had some Braille dots on it in certain positions and in certain rows. If I wanted to print something, the printer was actually connected to a PDP-8 computer that did the translation. So I could have my my keyboard and my system connected through a modem, 1200 baud, and then this PDP-8 would actually do the translation, so I could actually get Braille printouts. It was a pretty fascinating sort of thing, and it worked. But that was back in 1971, 1972, and 73 and beyond. But technology has changed a little bit since then, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has changed by many orders of magnitude and numbers.
Yes. Yeah, I'm being sarcastic.
Yeah.
So you went to work for a bank, and what did you primarily do for them?
Well, in fact, they had bought some microcomputers and didn't know exactly how to apply them in practice. So my first job there was to develop the needed application softwares in order to make these microcomputers useful. And when this was completed in a couple of months, then they started buying more and more microcomputers, and we needed more and more people. So I was at the time 20 something, and I had to manage a huge team and to develop a group of new programmers, which I had to train. I stayed there until 1986. And at the time I left, I was 25 and was managing a team of 40 people.
Now, when you were working at the bank, were you also doing work at São Paulo University?
Yes, in fact, at that time, I was a student. I was studying at São Paulo University because it was my wish to continue to study something related to math and science and computers. But at that time, at the public university here in São Paulo, the only course available with lectures at night was a course which was intended to build math professors. So that was the only choice I had. I went after it, and I decided to take that course. In fact, when I finished that course, that was 1 year after I left the bank, I had already started working on my own. Thanks to that, then I was able to start doing my course as a master in science, in computer science and applied math. And that took me another 5 years at the university. And after 1 year and a couple of months, I was invited to become a professor at the computer science department and stayed there for almost 12 years.
When you were studying and working at the bank, and then after you left the bank, I think you started your own consulting and went out on your own, right?
Yeah.
Okay. How did you do all of that at the same time? Because being a student is pretty much a full-time job typically, and working at the bank had to be a full-time job. That was a lot to do at once.
Yes, I think that's one of my abilities I developed over all my life, and managing to balance these very different things requires, in first place, a lot of discipline. And the other thing is, as I was studying many things, which were for me relatively easy. Studying math for me was never a problem. Attending classes was enough for me to be able to pass the exams. Exercises were just a task professors put on us, but they weren't for me a learning tool. I remember when I was in a very young child in sixth class, I was 10 years old. There was a professor in elementary school. Anyway, he didn't want to teach. He wrote a lot of math exercises for class to solve. And when he ended writing up all his exercises, I had already solved all but the last one. So he took my piece of paper and used it to correct the exercises of the others. And I used this time I had free inside class to do my other homework for the other. So this was an example of how I was able to manage various things at the same time.
So you worked at the bank during the day, right?
Yeah, from 9 in the morning to 6 p.m.
So classes were mostly at night for you then? Because
yes, they started about 7 p.m. and went until 10:30, 11 in the night. Yeah.
Wow. How'd you do homework?
Well, I the same way I learned to do it in school, inside the class.
Okay. Can you, have you ever been able to teach other people to develop those same skills? Have you ever tried to do that?
Well, in fact, that's one of my current projects. I'm involved in structuring this as a methodology to teach others to be able to do the same.
To multitask.
Yeah.
And be efficient. How's that working out?
Mm-hmm.
How is it? Is it working okay? Are you having success at teaching other people to do it?
Well, in fact, I'm starting in structuring materials. I'm not ready to, as a public, to offer this to the public at this moment. I hope to do this over the next 12 or 15 months.
Well, it sounds like it'd be a very fascinating thing to do. And if you can actually develop a program and a process and teach people to do it, that would certainly be a beneficial thing. At the same time, people do need to take some time to relax. Do you ever take time to relax?
Yes, of course.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah. But the best way I like to relax is traveling. Yeah. And this is also a subject I've developed very uncommon experiences due to many other works. Another way of relaxing, I always say, relaxing doesn't mean doing something. Relaxing means doing something different from what you are doing. That is changing your brain operation to a completely different area. Mm-hmm. And this can involve something like traveling. I like very much to travel by car, to plan travels, to get to know people in the way they live and not the way as tourist packages are normally offered. So to know people in fact. And another way of relaxing, let's say, I developed also very early. I started with this at the time I was at the bank. is in doing voluntary work, which involves promoting a cause and provides a way to know a lot of other people which are interested in the same cause, which have the same goals, but which is different from the working and the studying space. So switching from one environment to the other is a very efficient way to relax. Another arena I'm involved now for over 10 years is in sports. Yeah, so that's another way of relaxing, and I take this very seriously. Twice a week, I have my schedule reserved for that. Doesn't matter how much it rains or whatever happens.
What kind of sports?
Well, I'm playing volley now for 10 years.
Volleyball. Oh.
Yeah.
Indoor or outdoor?
Indoor.
Yeah, well, then you get away from the rain. Okay. Yeah. That's how you do that. Okay, I understand. Well, but even so, I hear what you're saying. And you really said something that I have felt for a long time. The problem with a lot of the guided tours and the tours that people buy is that you go somewhere and you're on a very strict schedule and you don't really get to know people, and you don't really get the same flavor of the environment that gives you a deeper knowledge and understanding. And I'm with you. I'd rather go somewhere and get a chance to meet people and spend some real time. My wife was a travel agent for a few years back when we first got married, and we would take occasional trips, familiarization trips. And again, they were well organized, but you didn't get to spend a lot of time. It was, as you would say today, very touristy. And so we found that it was a lot more fun when we took our own trips and really got to spend more time and get to know things a lot better than just the organized tours did.
Yes, I fully agree with that, and I always try to do it that way. Obviously, when you have a very short schedule, you have some meetings for work or for some organization where I volunteer, and you have to fly out and back in just 1 or 2 days, then you obviously cannot involve a lot of time to do that kind of exploration. But when I have at least a week to be at some place, I always like to reserve some time for this kind of local incursions.
One of the things that I also do is try to find, of course, for me, only knowing English, it has to be in English, but local radio stations, for example, that I can listen to really get a little bit more of a flavor. But yeah, I think you're right. And as a speaker, oftentimes I will go somewhere and not be able to spend a lot of time because it's like 1 or 2 days, and then I'm off again, or I come home. And so I don't get to know things as well as I would like. But I really enjoy it when I do have the time to spend a few days somewhere to get to know people and to get to know the country. It is so wonderful to be able to have that opportunity.
Yes, radio stations you mentioned are a very interesting strategy. I also use during my travels. I speak, obviously, Portuguese. I speak English. I fluent in Spanish, in German. So this allows me to communicate in many countries. But when I'm in a country where I don't know the language, the first thing I do is, if I rented a car, is hearing the radio. So to accustom the ear to the local language. And it obviously depends which country you are in. And in some cases, it will be relatively easy. Let's say, for example, when I was hearing the radio in the Netherlands, understanding Dutch, if you know English and German, is not that difficult once you get through the filter of the accent. On the other side, you have languages which are so complicated in their organization that you can hear radio or even television for hours or days and not be able to know the difference if you are hearing the news or the transmission of a sports event.
Yes. Chinese can
That
be
happened to
very...
me. Yeah, that happened to me in Poland.
In Poland.
In Poland, yes, the Polish language is very complicated because it's a language which has roots in Slavic, in Latin, and in the old German languages like German and English. So you have, for each word, you have to know from which of these roots this word comes from. So it's very, very difficult.
Well, then you also have languages like Chinese, which are extremely complex and extremely different from the sibilants and all aspects of it are significantly different from what we're all used to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. You have languages like Chinese, Japanese, or Hebrew, or languages like the Armenian, which use each of different writing structures and different sentence organization. But in this case, for example, if you look at written Polish, they use the Latin alphabet, but it's not understandable. I spent more than a week in Poland and managed to learn the basics, but it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
At least I was able to enter a restaurant and ask for sprinkling water or non-sprinkling water correctly.
Yes, or carbonated water or not carbonated water.
That was too much.
Yeah. Well, I hear you, and but it is fun to go to different places, and I've had the joy of traveling to all 50 states in the United States over the years, and there are different customs in different states, and it's fascinating just in this country, and you see some of it, of course, being around in different countries in South America, and certainly one of the larger ones. And again, the same thing, different customs, and it's fun and fascinating to meet people who observe different customs than we're used to.
Yes, in fact, I consider that a privilege. I think it's something which I got back from my volunteering. When I started as an entrepreneur, I started to volunteer in IT trade associations, and due to my ability to speak in various languages in a couple of years, I was allocated to international relations. So I started to get involved in international federations in this area. And due to this, I had the opportunity to travel a lot, mainly in the American area, from Canada to Argentina and in Europe. But in all, I've been in almost 50 countries. I've driven cars in 29 of them.
You certainly had a wonderful golden opportunity to experience a lot. I've been to a few countries, not 50, but I've been to a number, and really enjoy the people. And I think that's part of it, is that we have to recognize that not everybody's exactly the same way we are, and we shouldn't be disappointed if things aren't just the way we are used to here, or in your case where you are, because people and different civilizations or different cultures are different, and we should respect that. And sometimes I've seen tourists who don't, which is unfortunate. Well,
in fact, the more civilizations and different cultures you have I think you have a better understanding of how human life works. In fact, I think most humanity problems come from those people who live in a single culture, maybe due to religious beliefs, due to some autocratic government, which are restrained into a very single position. But I think most humans are in fact good people, even those involved in autocratic regimes.
Mm-hmm.
I won't tell the guy's name, but for example, I had the opportunity to chat for hours and hours with a guy in Cuba, which was part of the official Communist Party.
Right.
He in Cuba, for a couple of years now, you can have private businesses, but the licenses are only given out to members of the party. And it was my second time in Cuba, so I knew that I would be allowed to travel alone through the country. I went to visit a national park, which is about 300 kilometers north of La Habana. And then in the evening, I got to a very scenic city on the shore. And this guy had a license to operate a small hotel and restaurant there. So he invited me to, obviously paying, to have dinner there. And we started chatting. I came in, it was still day. And when I left his place, it was already after midnight to drive back to La Habana another 3 hours to
Wow.
come back to the hotel because the conference I was participating would start next day. But it was a very interesting chat, and after some doses of Cuban rum, he lost any restrictions on his tongue. He told me about his real life.
Mm-hmm. And that's the whole point, is to get to know people well enough to really have the opportunity to understand. So it's a lot of fun to do. Well, so you continue to this day to do math and deal obviously with science and so on. But when you left the bank, what did you start to do from a consulting and entrepreneurial standpoint? Although obviously you had an entrepreneurial spirit before then, but what did you start to do to earn an income and so on after leaving the bank?
Well, in the first years, I worked as a consultant. I did some programming, and I did a lot of teaching other people to learn to program. At that time, the C language was exploding on the market. Yeah. And here in Brazil, there were very few people who were able to teach that language to other programmers. Yeah. So at that time, I started teaching and also writing. I published some technical books in the programming arena at that time. Also was invited to translate some of the American authors which were writing about those subjects at that time. So I had a lot of involvement. And then when at the university, I went into the working my thesis. Then I started to develop a project about the development of user interfaces. That was at a time where not even Windows 3 was on the market. And that was the keystone to set up my first formal business.
Yeah.
That was 1990.
Yeah. Yep. Windows was around. I loved MS-DOS, but I also understand the value of Windows and graphic interfaces and all the other things that Windows brought. But for a while, MS-DOS was a much more accessible language or operating system for me to use than Windows, that wasn't really something that worked well with screen readers for blind people.
Mm-hmm.
And that evolved over time.
Yeah, technology always evolves. Basically, companies live from recycling what they do. And the you have to reinvent yourself every couple of years to stay on the market. And you have at this time no IT product you can buy which is on the market for more than 10 years.
If that long.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, and you're right. And look, there are some things that, although the products change, the basic concepts are things that have been around for a while. It's just that they evolve. I mean, look at integrated circuits. What are they? They're made up in part of a lot of transistors that came around first, and transistors came from tubes. And although the theory is a little bit different, basically what they do ultimately is the same thing, but we're getting faster and smaller and more efficient in everything that we do.
Yeah, in fact, that happens on the electronic arena. It happens also on the math side. If you look at the papers written by mathematicians like Post or von Neumann in the 30s and the 40s, the structure of current computers still obeys the basic ideas they put on paper. And I think what we are now seeing being developed, which changes this, is what is called the quantum computers.
Right.
That will change the theoretical background, but they are still very, very limited and need to use standard computers as an interface because they have no interface of their own up to this moment.
Right.
So maybe that in the future they will be just add-ons with very capable processors to do something what standard computers do not. But there's no clear way for them to gain the main market for us to have this kind of computers at home or in standard businesses.
Right. Not yet. But it will happen. It will happen. No doubt that it will happen at some point. Well, so going on that same discussion point, what about artificial intelligence? I actually listened to an interview with someone recently who said that the time is going to definitely come, and maybe not in the too distant future, but the time is going to come that computers will be able to truly create on their own and truly have the potential to overwhelming what we do. Do you think that's true?
I don't.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't. Artificial intelligence is a very old subject. I remember I was still a student at university. We were visited by Japanese professors, which were coming down here to tell us about what at that time was called their 5th generation computer project to develop artificial intelligence. That's 40 years ago. So, and we had a lot of press coverage during the last 12 months due to this kind of generative AI, which ChatGPT provides. But in fact, the algorithms which are based inside this kind of products are known in the computer science arena for decades. The main point is computing power available at the time wasn't enough to build big enough models so that they can simulate being humans. Yeah, that is I think the main difference nowadays. But this doesn't change the basic conceptual fact that they are just reproducing a combination of facts and knowledge which they collected from other humans. And creativity is very different from neural networks or from other AI so-called algorithms.
So you don't think that with, let's bring back into it, quantum computers and so on that take processing to a whole new level, you don't think that will give computers the opportunity to become creative in their own right and compete for experiences.
I think we won't see this in our generation. I think if you look at the human brain in detail, science has still not explained how it works, how humans are in fact able to connect ideas which have been stored in your brain for decades. Like I'm using now my brain in order to answer your question, and what's happening in my brain in order to module the words I'm saying to you. That's not yet explained. So it would be very, very difficult to have something simulating something we don't know how it works.
Yeah.
But the number of neurons we have inside the brain of every human is still bigger than any computer ever built. The other point is economical. I think it's another fact which people are not looking after, that these very huge AI models need a lot of computing power, so they are restricted to very huge organizations. And in fact, we are seeing that the capacity of data centers which are being used by this kind of models is restricted to what's called by the press the big tech companies.
Mm-hmm.
And smaller companies are just limited to pay them to use their capacity. The other point is the amount of electric power and the impact on environment this will all have could also be a limitation over time for the usage of this kind of computing. The same way, for example, it has been happening with some of these cryptocurrencies, which was also a huge promise for big changes for humanity. A couple of decades ago, and it still hasn't happened. In fact, we have obviously you have a range of people using this kind of stuff, but it has not got mainstream. Mainstream is still standard money. Banks continue to exist, and international trade is still conducted using standard money.
Well, and cryptocurrency took some big hits over the last year or two as well. And it is not the panacea that everyone said it was going to be.
Yeah, exactly. That's common in IT. We frequently have this kind of huge promises which then do not deliver. Metaverse, for example, is another example, which was very huge in hype in marketing a couple of years ago, and it seems also to have been disappearing these days behind AI.
Yeah, we're very fickle as a race. We just go by the latest thing or the thing that people start to publicize, and we forget the other things, and that's the problem. We don't focus very well, especially over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that requires the capacity to, at first, to remember all what has happened, and most people prefer to forget.
Yes, we do not learn from history nearly as well as we ought to.
Mm-hmm. And so that we are condemned to repeat it.
Good point. Well,
someone wrote this before me. I'm just repeating it. I don't remember who wrote this phrase.
No, I know what you're saying, though. I've heard that too. So what made you decide to, in addition to work, in addition to working and to being in school and being an academic, are you still doing things at São Paulo University?
No, I left university at the end of the 90s.
So you're just...
my involvement in the trade associations, plus at that time I had little children, 2 boys to care for, so that was too much to synchronize to manage all of this even for me, so I had to step down from university. People there didn't want me to leave. That was a battle for almost 2 years to be able to leave, but in the end, I left.
Children do take time, don't they?
Yeah. Yes, when they are small,
Especially.
children, yeah.
Well, but as they grow older, you have other challenges.
Yeah. You need less time, but resources you will still have to
you may need some less time, but it's got to be quality time.
Yeah.
Now, are you still married?
Yes. But I'm in a second marriage. My first marriage went
went a different way. Well,
yeah.
But it's good to have somebody to share with.
Yes, of course.
Now, have you taught her to multitask and be as organized as you?
I think it's relatively similar. Maybe not to the same level, but I think when we get older, we learn to see value in this kind of abilities in other people also.
Yeah, which is great. Why did you start volunteering and doing some of that in the first place?
Well, I had started volunteering when I was still at the bank to organize user groups to foster the introduction of microcomputers here. At that time, I was involved with what was called the Microsoft User Group, which was...
I remember that.
Yeah. And I even had the opportunity to interact in person with Bill Gates when he was just a couple of millions worth, not billions.
You mean that guy who said we never need any more than, what was it, 64K of memory?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
He traveled here to Brazil for the first time in 1987. And at that time, due to my English, I was in charge to helping him out with the lectures he was going to provide at our meetings. And I also had a long conversation one evening, in fact, one night. There was a huge meeting at the house of the guy who at that time was the president of the user group. And this guy had also commercial interests in representing Microsoft in Brazil, and he invited many politicians and other businessmen, and they were all on Bill Gates' side the whole evening. And I remember it was always midnight. The owner of the house called me in to the side and asked me if I was able to have a bit and byte conversation in English. I said, yeah, of course. And then he said me, Bill Gates is already tired of speaking about economics, politics, and business. He's asking for someone to talk about technical subjects. So I had the privilege to sit on a sofa lying in a room there in that big house with Bill Gates for almost 2 hours, chatting about technical subjects. At that time, Microsoft was developing what was called the QUIC, a family of programming languages, which then became the Visual family, which is still on the market today now, like Visual Basic and maybe the most known one. So I think that was also a privileged situation. And getting back to what you were calling about the volunteering, due to all these experiences, I also started writing as a volunteer for some magazines and some newspapers, regular columns, and due to this publicity, then people who were at that time leaders for the IT trade associations came after me and invited me to participate. And I in that arena. I have a very very long training on the state level, then on the national level, and then on the international level. And I so much that about 8 years ago, I wrote a book about all this experience.
What's it called?
Well, it's written in Portuguese.
Yes.
Yeah, the title, translating it into English, it would be something like "Together We Are More." In fact, when you gather, the basic idea is when you gather together people which are after the same cause, then you have a lot of techniques you can apply in order to influence public opinion, governments, and to create relations about the communities you are connecting, because business is always between people. So when you want to do international trade, for example, you have to develop, in the first place, relations, and in the second place, trust with other people. Otherwise, you can travel a lot, spend a lot of money, but you won't be able to sell anything.
Going back to Bill Gates for just a quick second, would you say that Bill Gates is clearly one of the leading visionaries of our time?
I don't think so at the current time, but he was at that time. I think he and Steve Jobs set up an infrastructure for change in the IT arena, which we are still experiencing the consequences of what they set up.
Who would you say are the leading visionaries today in all of that?
Well, I think we don't have someone we could call a very big visionary. Some people, many people are trying to be this person, but it doesn't matter if you look at Elon Musk or at the guy from Oracle. They are not presenting anything which, in fact, will bring in as huge changes as these two guys we were talking before have.
My thought is Elon Musk should have stayed with the Tesla vehicles. He's done more to change and bring about, and could do more to bring about change regarding vehicles and electric vehicles and so on. And going into the technology world, I think there are some issues there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, but I don't. But electric vehicles are not a new invention. In fact, electric vehicles existed before those which are powered on oil. So the first experiments done in Germany at the end of the 19th, in the late 19th century, were electrical vehicles. And then the oil-based motors obviously showed much more power, so they replaced them, and that got into production. So I think this is an evolutionary process.
What I think I'm saying, though.
Yes, what is now called the traditional car makers like GM or Ford or Honda or the others, they have the capacity to produce similar products. There's no invention, no patent, nothing which makes the Tesla production unique.
I guess what I'm saying, though, is that I think he stood and stands a bigger chance of having a greater impact if he had stuck with that than going into some of the computer stuff where he clearly does not. But everybody makes their own choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. I think if you look at his work at Twitter, then I think we should laugh.
Exactly.
In fact, he's been able to, at least that's the way I see it. Twitter has basically been destroyed by his policies inside the company.
Yeah, I think that's
the people who,
true.
in fact, created the code have left the company, and changing the name doesn't make any good.
No, it makes no sense and doesn't help anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you've been writing. What are some of the more recent books that you've written?
Well, after this book for the IT Trade Association experience, I started working on another book in a very different arena. I got involved in mutual support groups for people and families which are involved with addiction due to a problem in my current family. And due to all this experience I had previously in other voluntary movements I was telling you before, then I was able to understand the significance of this and also to ask questions which most participants had never made before.
Mm-hmm.
So I was led to get in touch with the founders, the leaders, and I myself decided to research subjects which had not been researched before. Maybe you or the audience have heard about the Serenity Prayer, which
Mm-hmm.
is famous in the 30s due to Alcoholic Anonymous,
Right.
which is used in most of mutual support groups. But most people just repeat it in a very mechanical way
And don't think about it.
they don't think what it really means. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I had that was another very interesting coincidence. One of the founders of the movement I participated at that time was an American priest, a Jesuit father, which was American. He was born in southern Texas, near to the Mexican border, and came here to Brazil at the end of the 60s. He lived up to 100 years and 9 months in age. And during his last, let's say, 5 or 6 years of life, in fact, I had a lot of interaction with him. And he has written the forward to this book I wrote about the Serenity Prayer. He even instigated me to publish this book in the United States, put me in contact with some Jesuits in America. But then the pandemic came in, so this is still on my to-do list.
Well, I hope it does get published in the United States. I think it would be very beneficial to do it. What got you involved in the whole issue of religion, and and spirituality and so on?
Well, in fact, it's not religion and spirituality are mixed up due to interests by many people, but in fact, they in my vision they are two very different concepts. I was born in a Jewish family, so I have this worldview since a child, but I've never been Orthodox, so I've always been open to understand other people, and even have over time participated in many other cults. But the main fact is, when you look at religions, they try to explain how you have to behave or what's expected in order for you to get some kind of reward, maybe in this world or what's called the next world, where we'll be after our death as physical humans.
Mm-hmm.
And spirituality, in my view, is something very different. Spirituality is, in fact, a couple of rules which teach you how to behave, how to act, so that you can benefit from that and others are not damaged by the way you are acting. And it's about interaction and action, and this is very different from religion. If you look at human history, doesn't matter if you look at Western civilization, like the Crusades in the Middle Age, or what's happening over the centuries in India. There are a lot of human wars which have been fought just for religious differences. So that's a very, very complicated subject which we could be talking about for
hours.
hours. Yes. Yeah.
Well,
I have even a whole speech about the subject, telling this history of religions and how spirituality is different. It is a very interesting subject, and it is one of the subjects I touch in this last book.
What is so unfortunate is God everywhere, but every religion thinks that it's the only way to get to God, and and God just supports that religion, and neither of those is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, the most religious leaders try to use this as a way of, in some way, gaining power.
Yeah,
right? That's what history has shown us.
Yeah, it's not that way at all.
Mm-hmm. Of course, but I think this process of people understanding this and acting in a way which is collectively positive for the whole of humanity is, in fact, something which is still in its beginnings. We still have wars for religious reasons.
Well, or we have wars and some of the people try to say it's for religious reasons, but it's not. I mean, we've experienced over, a little while, the whole issue with Israel and Hamas and Israel and I'm not going to say the Muslim world, because I think it doesn't need to be that way. If you deal with the fact that in reality, it's the same God, but some people try to use it again for their own purposes rather than really being very spiritual about it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, at the moment you fire, doesn't matter if it's a rifle, a missile, or a bomb, you are damaging another human. So
yep.
At that moment, you have stopped having a spiritual behavior.
Correct.
Doesn't matter in what direction you are sending your mission. Yeah.
You mentioned mutual support groups. Tell me more about that.
Well, this Jesuit I mentioned, who wrote the foreword to my book, he was responsible. His name was Harold Ram, and he brought to Brazil an American movement called Tough Love to help families of people involved with addiction. And then that got some kind of adaptation here in Brazil. And after a couple of years, this movement is still active, but I participated there also. But I had some problems with after this book came out. I had some very difficult problems there, and I think they were very, very stuck at what they had made up and didn't want to change anything. And I think the main reason behind is this, that the contents I set up in this book were showing something was really needed. Over any human invention needs to be adapted over time, because we are not God. We are not perfect. So what we make up can always be bettered. And so it's now almost 4 years, we have set up a new organization called Conscious Love, translating it from Portuguese, which has the same purpose, but we have done a lot of updates to the methodology and having expanded it to cover not only addiction, but also other kind of very difficult situations people can have in life, like, for example, people who have children with strong disabilities like autism or others, which are really difficult to handle. So
have you
yeah,
had any addiction issues in your family?
yeah.
Mm.
Mhm.
So that brings it personal and a little bit closer to home.
Yes, yes. Of course, the addiction in society is still a kind of taboo. Right? You don't know. Most people don't know what's happening. Most people don't want to learn about it, and it's very, very. At least here in Brazil, most people who are not informed about the subject tend to do some moral judgment, right? While in fact it's a disease.
Yeah. I know, and there are a lot of people who drink a lot of alcohol. I've never liked the taste of alcohol. I can drink wine and I can occasionally have a drink, but I've seen people drunk, and I just don't ever want to be in that position. It doesn't help. I've seen how people behave, and some of the times it's not been from a person who's an alcoholic. They just overindulged once. When I was in college, there was one colleague who just drank to excess one night. He wasn't an alcoholic. He never did it again, but he got really sick from all the drinking. He never did that again, at least in the time that I knew him. But it's a problem, and we also try to use some of those things to cover up our own fears, and we don't learn to deal with those either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, from what I've learned is most people are in this situation you are mentioning. They get sick once, they consider it very, very bad to be in that situation and don't repeat it. But that's another arena where science is still in depth with humanity. And there is a small group of people which go into addiction very easily. That is, what they sense after using alcohol or other substances is so important for them that they transform themselves in a kind of slaves who want to repeat this experience again and again and again. And medicine already knows that when you repeat this process, the amount of alcohol or other substances you need to provoke the same result in your body gets bigger and bigger. So that's the reason why people who start to drink regularly then drink every time more, and in general this brings huge health problems for people when they don't stop.
And it brings problems for all.
Other kinds of what's called more heavy drugs. In general, people stop earlier because the consequences come up much rapidly.
And for the people who don't want to face the consequences, then it's not only a problem for them, but it becomes more of a problem for all of us.
Yes, and for people who live with them. That's the main point. Every single person who's in addiction provokes problems for at least 4 other people around them. And that's the reason why these support groups exist, because supporting these people is not a standard public policy up to this moment in any country in the world I know. Governments are into what's called the drug wars and not about the process of healing families. Some health organizations around the world help people who are in addiction, but the families around them have very little support.
And so they don't know what to do about it. And
Yes. They
When
not only know what to do, but it's so that the addiction changes people's
right,
behavior very radically,
right,
and this creates very strong emotions inside us when you live together with up to the point you think that you are the worst person in the world. You're having
yeah,
such huge problems that nobody else have passed through this, and this is not true. In fact, everyone who goes through this process has the same kind of behavior, but this is taboo. You have not access to this information, then you are put into this. So this the first thing we say in support groups when you come in is you are not alone. And there are a lot of people who've gone through the same process.
and that's the real point, and that's the value of support groups, is that there are people who've been there, they've done that, and if you let them into your lives, then you learn a lot more about how to deal with it, and how to address it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what kind of activities and initiatives do you have coming up? What's next for you?
Well, I told you at the beginning of our conversation, I'm into transforming my abilities in time management and discipline into a methodology.
Right.
This will become probably another book, will become obviously a lot of teachings, and structuring this kind of thing is has to be done very carefully, because you are involved directly with people's life. So the idea is helping people to live more significantly, to balance all areas of life. It's customary that people say, I don't have time to do that and that, but it's just a matter of choices. Every day, every moment, we can choose what we want to do.
Always about choice.
Yeah, exactly.
It's always about choice.
So this has to be done very carefully, and I think this many experiences I've been telling you about has put me into a situation where I can understand the impact of this. It's very different when you talk about something like this with people like us in the American scenario, or if you look at people in other cultures. So this has to be respected, but at the same time, humans are, although there are differences, we have also similarities which can be explored if you are carefully to deliver this, I believe, worldwide. But this is a huge pretension, and I'm doing it carefully so that it really goes through it. I'm not in a hurry to produce this publicly, but I'm already developed some speeches with some parts of this, and I think people are liking it.
Well, I hope it gets translated into English as it gets done, and I would love to read it.
Yes,
So,
in fact, the work we are doing in the conscious life movement, we are already developing many things in various languages. And while you were asking me the previous question, I was remembering a phrase from Elizabeth Gilbert, which wrote that about her experience traveling in the Middle East and then to the Far East, which got into a film. Maybe you've heard about her. And she is also a person which had addiction problems. And there's a phrase I remembered when you were talking about religion and spirituality. She says that religions are the way they promise you to save you from hell. And spirituality is for those who have already been in hell.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. We've done well over an hour, and that's fine. That means we've enjoyed it, and I hope everyone listening has enjoyed it. And I really appreciate you being here. And I hope that you listening enjoyed this and found it useful and inspiring and helpful as well. Love to hear your thoughts. So how can people reach out to you, learn about what you do as a consultant and so on? And if they'd like to reach out, how do they do that?
Well, the easiest way is I have a website. My personal website is Roberto C. Meyer, my name, .com.br.
Can you spell that?
Background, I have a QR code projected here in my background where people can access this directly.
Could you go ahead and spell the website?
Yes, it's the domain name is my name. It's Roberto, Roberto C, which is the initial of my middle name. Meyer, my surname, Mayer.com.br from Brazil.
Brazil, right. Okay. Well, I hope people will reach out. I very much enjoyed this and also want to keep in touch. We can certainly explore that. But I want to thank you. And I also want to thank you for listening. If you'd like to reach out to me, anyone, you're welcome to do that. I'd love to get your thoughts and comments. Feel free to email me at michaelhi, MICHAELHI, at accessibe.com, or go to our website, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast, and Hingson is HINGSON. So www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Wherever you're listening, please give us a 5-star rating. We love those ratings and we really value them and appreciate them and all of the comments that you want to make. So please give us a 5-star rating and review the podcast, and hope you'll listen to other episodes if you haven't. If you just discovered us, welcome. Hope to see you on more of these. And Roberto, one last time, I want to thank you for being with us and spending all your time.
Thanks to you, Michael, for your invitation. And if you want me again, please just tell me so.